The Grand Academy of Allied Species hung in geostationary orbit above the neutral world of Threshold, a monument to interstellar cooperation constructed from imported stone and shared arrogance. Its central chamber, the Hall of Concordant Voices, could seat 3,000 delegates across 11 atmosphere zones, and tonight it held precisely 247 of the most influential military liaisons in the known galaxy. Commander Thalix Voran stood at the central podium, his Keth Dominion uniform crisp with ceremonial silver threading, his secondary eyelids flickering in the dry, recycled air. Behind him, a holographic star map displayed the territorial boundaries of 41 spacefaring civilizations. Human space occupied a modest cluster near the Orion Spur, unremarkable in volume, unremarkable in resources. The casualty projections scrolling beside it were anything but unremarkable. Over the past 12 standard cycles, Voran intoned, his translator implant rendering the Keth clicking speech into flawless galactic common, humanity has participated in 8 border conflicts, 3 defensive alliances, and 1 intervention classified as humanitarian. Their losses have been, in every engagement, statistically anomalous. He paused, allowing the data to settle over the chamber like frost. Their casualty ratios are inverted, he continued. In conflicts where humans fight alone, they sustain fewer fatalities than their opponents by a factor of 4.6. In conflicts where humans fight alongside Allied forces, Allied casualties decrease by an average of 62%, while human casualties remain constant. They are absorbing the attrition without increasing their exposure. Our analysts cannot explain the math. A murmur rippled through the delegates. The Torek Combine representative, a hulking quadruped named Gorthak, shifted his armored bulk and growled something his translator rendered as superior battle drugs. Voran's secondary eyelids flickered faster. We tested for chemical enhancement. Negative. We tested for genetic modification. Negative. We tested for undisclosed technology. Negative. Humanity's soldiers are baseline biological entities operating with standard-issue equipment that, by our measurements, should be obsolete. He let the silence stretch. Which brings me to the purpose of this briefing. The star map dissolved, replaced by a schematic of human military infrastructure, training academies, boot camps, officer candidate schools, reserve mobilization centers. Thousands of facilities scattered across dozens of worlds, processing what appeared to be a minuscule fraction of the human population through formal combat instruction. The human species maintains an extraordinarily small standing military relative to their total population, Voran said. Less than half of 1% serve in active combat roles. An additional 2% serve in support and reserve capacities. The remaining 97.5% of their population has never received formal military instruction of any kind. He highlighted a cluster of data points. And yet, during the siege of Procyon Anchorage, a human civilian freighter crew with no combat training successfully repelled a Klagan boarding action using cargo loaders, emergency hull sealant, and what our after-action report describes as extreme improvisational violence. During the Varkesh incursion of 78, a human agricultural settlement with 0 military assets eliminated an entire raiding company over a period of 8 days. The settlement suffered 3 casualties. The Varkesh lost 91 personnel and withdrew from the system entirely. Voran straightened, his posture rigid with institutional tension. The question before this body is straightforward. What are the humans doing to their soldiers, and how can we replicate it? The chamber stirred. Delegates leaned forward. A junior Torek diplomat, young enough that his cranial plates hadn't fully fused, raised a manipulator limb and spoke without waiting for recognition. Which humans are trained? The question hung in the air, simple and direct. Voran opened his mouth to respond, and a different voice filled the chamber, quiet and dry as autumn leaves scraping stone. You should pray none are angry. Every head turned toward the source. Dr. Alara Vance sat at the far end of the advisory bench, a position she had occupied for 30 cycles without ever speaking during a full session. Her human hair had gone white decades ago. Her human eyes, pale blue and wet with something no alien in the room could identify, gazed at the Torek diplomat with an expression that made his cranial plates flatten against his skull in involuntary submission. The chamber fell into absolute stillness. "I'm sorry," the Torek diplomat managed, his translator stuttering. "That sounded like a threat." Alara Vance did not blink. "It wasn't," she said. "A threat requires intent. I'm offering a prayer for you." Part 2. The Weight of the Whisper. The chamber dissolved into chaos. 12 delegations began speaking simultaneously. 3 demanded Alara Vance's immediate removal. 2 more demanded her censure. The Torek Combine representative, the elder one, not the young diplomat who had asked the question, rose to his full height and bellowed something about diplomatic protocols and the prohibition of intimidation from advisory staff. Gorthak's voice cut through the noise. "The human threatens this body, and you expect us to sit." Commander Vorin raised both hands, a gesture he had learned from humans and which no other species in the chamber recognized. The unfamiliarity of it bought him a moment of silence. "Dr. Vance," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "has served this academy for 30 cycles. She has provided the single most valuable threat assessment of human psychology we possess. She has never, not once, spoken during an open session unless she believed the stakes warranted it." He turned to face her directly. "Dr. Vance, please, explain to the delegates what you meant." Alara rose slowly, her joints protesting with small audible clicks that the chamber's sensitive acoustic systems captured and amplified. She walked to the podium with the measured gait of someone who had long ago made peace with pain, and when she reached Vorin's side, she placed one weathered hand on the edge of the data console. "30 cycles ago," she began, "the Academy hired me to answer a question. They wanted to know why human soldiers were so effective. They assumed, as all of you are assuming now, that the answer lay in training, in technique, in something we were doing to our soldiers." She called up an image on the holographic display. A human brain, rendered in full neural mapping detail, with certain regions highlighted in amber. "I spent my first 10 cycles studying every human military training program I could access. Basic combat training, advanced infantry school, special operations selection. I studied the methods, the curricula, the psychological conditioning protocols, and I found something I did not expect." She advanced the image. The amber-highlighted regions grew more numerous, connecting into a network that spread across the entire brain. "Human military training does not install combat capability. It does not teach a human to fight. What it does, what it has always done, is teach a human when to fight and, more importantly, when to stop." The Torek representative rumbled skepticism. "You expect us to believe that an untrained human is more dangerous than a trained one." "No," Alara said. "I expect you to understand that a trained human is a human who has learned to close a door. An untrained human is a human who doesn't know the door exists, and if something breaks that door open." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice had dropped to something barely above silence, yet it carried through the chamber with terrible clarity. "Have you ever wondered why humans create so much art about monsters? Why their stories are filled with transformations, with ordinary people becoming something terrible when pushed past a certain threshold? It's not fiction. It's not fantasy. It's memory." She turned to face the young Torek diplomat directly. "You asked which humans are trained. The answer is all of them. Every single human is trained from the moment they can understand language to suppress something that lives in the oldest parts of their brain. Their entire civilization is a training program. Their laws, their ethics, their religions, all of it exists to keep that door closed." She stepped away from the podium. And when you ask which humans are trained for combat, what you are really asking is which humans have been taught to open the door under controlled conditions. And I am telling you, I am praying for you, that you never meet one who opens it without controls. The chamber was silent. Commander Vorin, who had known Alara for 20 cycles, realized his hands were trembling. Part 3. The Dusk Glass Incident. The Academy's classified archives contained a file designation that no delegate in the chamber had clearance to access. Commander Vorin had read it exactly once, 11 cycles ago, when it first crossed his desk with a priority header that overrode every security protocol in the system. He called it up now, transmitting it directly to the delegates, personal displays with a level of classification, override he would almost certainly be court-martialed for. Dusk Glass, he said, a human frontier colony, population 812, primary industry agricultural terraforming, military presence none, strategic value negligible. The display showed a modest settlement, prefabricated habitats arranged in concentric rings around a central processing facility, surrounded by endless fields of genetically modified soil bacteria that were slowly converting the planet's alkaline surface into arable land. It was the kind of place that invasion planners ignored because there was nothing worth taking. 11 cycles ago, a Varkesh raiding force comprising 91 personnel and 3 assault landers entered the Dusk Glass system. Their objective was resource denial. They intended to destroy the settlement, eliminate the colonists, and send a message to human expansion efforts in the region. The display shifted to tactical readouts, troop movements, engagement timelines, a casualty counter that told a story no one in the chamber could process. The engagement lasted 71 hours, Vorin said. At the end of that period, the Varkesh force had sustained 88 fatalities. 3 survivors were recovered from a drainage culvert 8 kilometers from the settlement. All 3 were catatonic. 1 died of self-inflicted injuries during transport. The remaining 2 have never regained speech. He let the numbers settle. Human casualties, 3. A child caught in the initial bombardment. An elderly colonist who suffered cardiac failure during evacuation, and a geological surveyor named Aldrich Kincaid, who was killed on the first day while attempting to warn the settlement. The display showed a human woman, middle-aged, weather-worn face, hair pulled back in a practical knot. Her file photograph had been taken from a colony personnel record, and she looked exactly like what she was, an agricultural engineer who had spent her career studying soil composition. "This is Rosa Kincaid," Vorin said, "wife of the deceased surveyor, mother of the child killed in the initial attack. She had no military training, no combat experience, no weapons qualifications. Her personnel file lists her hobbies as botany, textile weaving, and amateur geology." He advanced the display. She killed 88 Varkesh raiders over the course of 3 days using a modified fertilizer spreader, 12 canisters of industrial defoliant, her husband's geological survey charges, a grain thresher she reconfigured into an area denial system, and, in the final engagement, her bare hands. The chamber had gone very still. The Varkesh survivors were debriefed under chemical compulsion. Their testimony is consistent. They describe being hunted by someone who understood the terrain with impossible intimacy, who appeared and disappeared without pattern, who used the land itself as a weapon, collapsing sinkholes, triggering rock slides, poisoning water sources, setting fires that moved against the wind. Vorin looked up from the display. One survivor described her as not a soldier. When pressed for clarification, he said, "A soldier fights, she executed. There was no anger in her face. There was nothing in her face. She was the land. The land was killing us and she was just the part of it that had hands." Dr. Vance spoke from her position at the advisory bench, her voice soft. When our debriefing team asked Rosa Kincaid how she had accomplished what she did, she gave them a single sentence. She said, "I remembered what we're supposed to forget." The Torek representative's cranial plates had flattened completely against his skull. "What does that mean?" he demanded. Alara met his gaze. "It means what I told you 30 cycles ago and what I've been telling you ever since. The training is not the weapon. The training is the safety. And when you take away everything a human loves, you do not break the safety. You remove it." Part 4. The question behind the question. Commander Vorin let the Dusk Glass file fade from the delegates' displays, but the damage was done. The numbers had seared themselves into the chamber's collective consciousness. 88-3. A civilian woman with farm equipment against an armored raiding force. The math was not math. It was a warning dressed in arithmetic. The Academy suppressed the Dusk Glass report, Vorin admitted, his voice heavy with institutional shame. "We classified it under the Xenopsychological Hazard Protocol. We told ourselves we were preventing panic. What we were actually doing was avoiding the conclusion that Dr. Vance had already reached 10 cycles earlier and that we had refused to accept." He turned to face Alara directly. "Doctor, tell them the conclusion." Alara rose again, and this time her movements were slower, weighted with the exhaustion of someone who had spent 3 decades trying to make people understand something they did not want to understand. "When I first presented my findings to the Academy," she said, "I was told that my conclusions were culturally biased, that I was projecting human mythology onto empirical data, that the idea of a species-wide latent combat instinct was biologically impossible and evolutionarily absurd." She smiled, and there was no warmth in it. "Every species in this chamber evolved under predation pressure. Every one of you has a fight-or-flight response, but your fight responses are calibrated. You fight until the threat recedes and then you stop. It's economical. It's rational. It's how evolution works when the goal is survival." She called up a new image, a comparison chart showing stress hormone curves across 12 species. 11 of them followed a predictable pattern: sharp spike, gradual decline, return to baseline. The human curve was different. It spiked, plateaued, and then kept going, maintaining elevated levels for durations that should have caused catastrophic organ failure. "Humans evolved under a different pressure," Alara said. "Their ancestors did not simply evade predators. They eliminated them, systematically, across an entire planet. They did not stop when the threat receded because they learned, over hundreds of thousands of years, that stopping meant dying later. The predator that runs today hunts tomorrow, so they learned to ensure there was no tomorrow." She let the chart speak for itself. "This is not a conscious process. It is a neurological state that human psychologists call the awful arithmetic, a shift in cognitive processing that occurs when a human's threat assessment systems override their social inhibition systems. In this state, other beings cease to register as people. They become problems, and humans are very, very good at solving problems." The young Torek diplomat who had asked the original question spoke again, his voice smaller than before. "How do they trigger this state?" "They don't," Alara said. "That's the point. They spend their entire lives learning not to trigger it. Every human culture on record has developed systems of restraint, ethics, laws, social contracts, religious prohibitions, all designed to prevent the awful arithmetic from engaging. Human military training is not about teaching soldiers to access this state. It's about teaching them to access it under controlled conditions and then critically to come back." She looked around the chamber, making eye contact with as many delegates as her gaze could reach. "When you asked which humans are trained, you were asking the wrong question. The question you should be asking is, how many humans have learned to close the door? And the answer is, all of them. Their entire species has learned it. It is the foundation of their civilization. And every single human you meet is someone who is, at every moment, actively choosing not to become what they are capable of becoming." The silence that followed was not the silence of comprehension. It was the silence of dawning, absolute horror. "You are surrounded," Alara said quietly, "by weapons that have chosen to be people. Pray you never give them reason to reconsider." Part 5. The Demonstration. Gorthak of the Torek Combine had heard enough. His species had built their dominion on the certainty of their own martial superiority, massive frames, natural armor plating. A warrior culture that had conquered 17 systems before encountering the broader galactic community. The idea that a soft-skinned, endoskeletal species with no natural weapons could pose a threat that required prayer was, to him, an insult. "Words," he rumbled, his translator struggling to convey the depth of his contempt. "You give us words, stories, a single incident that could be fabrication. You expect the Combine to alter its strategic posture based on the testimony of one elderly human and a suppressed report that no one in this chamber can verify." Commander Voron's secondary eyelids flickered rapidly, a Keth stress response that Alara had learned to recognize decades ago. "Representative Gorthak," Voron said, "I understand your skepticism. The Academy shared it for many cycles, which is why, 8 cycles ago, we requested permission from human authorities to observe a training exercise. Specifically, we asked to observe what happens when a human trainee fails to maintain the controls Dr. Vance has described." The chamber stirred with renewed attention. "Human military command denied our request," Voron continued. "They cited safety concerns, not for the trainee, but for the observers. They did, however, provide us with archival footage of an incident that occurred during a special operations selection course 31 cycles ago. The footage has been redacted for security purposes, but the relevant portions are intact." He paused, and Alara saw his hands tremble again. "I must warn this body that what you are about to witness is disturbing. The human in the footage is not injured. He is not chemically altered. He is simply no longer holding back." The holographic display flickered, and the chamber's lighting dimmed automatically. The footage was grainy, captured on monitoring equipment that had clearly not been designed for public dissemination. It showed a training facility, concrete walls, padded floors, observation windows reflecting fluorescent light. A human male in exercise clothing stood at the center of a large room, surrounded by 8 other humans in instructor uniforms. The audio was poor, but the delegates could make out a voice speaking calmly. "Need you to re-establish control. You know the protocol. Breathe, count, come back to baseline." The man in the center did not respond. His posture was relaxed, his arms loose at his sides. His face was visible in profile, and there was something about it that made Alara's chest tighten even after all these years. She had seen that expression before in the file photos from Dusk Glass. It was not anger. It was not rage. It was absence, the face of someone whose social cognition had shut down entirely, leaving nothing but pure, unfiltered threat assessment. What happened next took less than 12 seconds. The man moved. The instructors, highly trained special operations personnel with decades of combined experience, reacted with professional speed. It did not matter. The man flowed through them like water through broken reeds, his movements precise and economical in ways that seemed to ignore the limitations of human biomechanics. Joints were hyperextended. Pressure points were struck with accuracy that suggested intimate knowledge of the nervous system. 4 instructors were incapacitated before the others could even close the distance. The 5th instructor deployed a stun weapon. The man in the center took it from him, reversed it, and applied it with clinical efficiency. The 6th and 7th instructors attempted a coordinated takedown. The man used their momentum against them, redirecting their mass into each other with a fluidity that made the Torek delegates' cranial plates flatten in instinctive submission. The 8th instructor, an older human with gray hair and a face that spoke of long experience, did not attempt to engage. Instead, he spoke a single word. The audio was too degraded to make it out, but the effect was immediate. The man in the center stopped moving. His shoulders dropped, his hands unclenched, and his face, visible for a moment in full frame, shifted from that terrible absence back into something recognizably human. The footage ended. Commander Voron's voice was hoarse. The eighth instructor was the trainee's father. The word he spoke was his son's name. The after-action report contained a single line of analysis. Subject remembered something we taught him to forget. The chamber was silent for a long, long moment. Then Alara spoke, her voice carrying the weight of 30 cycles of terrible knowledge. The man in that footage was not special. He was not unique. He was a candidate for a program that selects for stability, for the ability to maintain control under extreme stress. What you saw was what happens when that control slips for less than 12 seconds in a human who has been trained to open the door. She looked at Gorthak. Now imagine what happens when a human who has not been trained to close it again suffers a loss like Rosa Kincaid suffered. Imagine a population of billions, all carrying the same latent capability, all held in check by nothing more than the social contract they have built around themselves. Imagine what happens when that contract breaks. Gorthak said nothing. His cranial plates remained flat against his skull. Part 6, The Reality. The briefing was supposed to end there. Commander Voron had prepared closing remarks, a summary of key findings, a list of recommended diplomatic protocols for interacting with human populations. The Academy liked its briefings neat, with actionable conclusions and clear policy implications. Dr. Vance had other intentions. She had not spoken in 30 cycles because she had learned early in her tenure that the Academy was not interested in the truth she had uncovered. They wanted explanations that fit their existing frameworks, tactical doctrines, technological assessments, training methodologies they could replicate or counter. What she had discovered was something far more fundamental and far less comfortable. Now, with the chamber already reeling from the footage, she decided to finish what she had started 3 decades ago. "I want to tell you about the awful arithmetic," she said, stepping back to the podium despite Commander Voron's uncertain expression. "It's not a formal term. Human military psychologists don't use it in their literature. I coined it myself after interviewing 300 human combat veterans across 12 conflicts." She called up a series of interview transcripts, names redacted, words highlighted in amber. "The awful arithmetic is what happens when a human's threat assessment systems fully override their social cognition. In this state, the human brain ceases to process other beings as people. They become variables, threats to be neutralized, obstacles to be removed, problems to be solved. The human will pursue this problem solving with the same cognitive resources they would apply to any complex task, engineering a bridge, composing a symphony, calculating orbital mechanics. All of their intelligence, all of their creativity, all of their pattern recognition capability becomes focused on a single objective, the elimination of the threat." She paused, letting the implications sink in. This is not mindless rage. It is not animal fury. It is cold. It is deliberate. It is, by every measure we have, the most sophisticated targeting system ever observed in a biological organism, and it exists in latent form in every single human being. The Taurek representative's voice was noticeably quieter than before. "If this is true, how has their species not destroyed itself?" "Because they know," Alara said. "They have always known. Every human culture has stories about what happens when someone snaps, when the controls fail and the awful arithmetic takes over. They have built their entire civilization around preventing that threshold from being crossed. Their laws, their ethics, their religions, their art, all of it is a collective agreement to stay human, to keep the door closed, to remember what they are capable of and choose not to become it." She turned to face the full chamber. "What you call human military training is not the creation of weapons. It is the creation of safeties. Human soldiers are not taught to kill. They are taught to kill only when necessary and to stop when the necessity ends. The training is the hardest thing any human will ever do because it requires them to open the door under controlled conditions, to face what lives on the other side, and then to close it again. Most of them can't do it. The selection criteria are brutal, and the washout rates are high. But the ones who succeed become something remarkable. Humans who can access the awful arithmetic and return from it. Humans who can be weapons without becoming monsters. She let her gaze sweep across the delegates, one by one. The rest of humanity, the 97% you dismiss as untrained, they haven't learned to open the door. They've only learned to keep it closed. And if something breaks that door open, if you take everything from them, if you push them past the threshold that their entire civilization exists to maintain, then you will face something that no human soldier would ever become, because soldiers remember to stop. The untrained, once the door is broken, may not remember how. The silence in the chamber had become a physical presence, pressing against every being present. "You asked which humans are trained," Alara said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The answer is that it doesn't matter. The question you should be asking is which humans are angry, and my answer, my prayer, is that you never find out." Part 7, The Prayer. The briefing ended in disarray. Delegates filed out of the chamber in clusters, speaking in hushed tones that their translators struggled to render. Some species expressed vocal stress in frequencies outside the standard audible range, creating an undertone of ultrasonic distress that made the Academy's maintenance staff pause in their duties. Gorthak of the Torek Combine remained seated for a long time after the others had departed. His cranial plates, still flat against his skull, gave him an almost juvenile appearance despite his massive frame. When he finally rose, he did not speak to anyone. He simply walked, slowly, heavily, toward the exit, his earlier bluster replaced by something that looked, to those who knew Torek body language, very much like fear. Commander Vorin stood at the podium, watching the chamber empty. His secondary eyelids had stopped flickering. His hands had stopped trembling. What remained was a deep, bone-aching exhaustion that he suspected would never fully lift. "I should have let you speak 30 cycles ago," he said quietly. Ilara, who had not moved from her position at the advisory bench, offered a small shrug. "You weren't ready to hear it. They weren't ready either, but I'm running out of time to wait." Vorin turned to face her, and for the first time in 20 cycles of working together, he allowed himself to really look at her. The lines on her face, the whiteness of her hair, the slight tremor in her hands that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with carrying a burden no one else would share. "The Academy will reclassify humanity," he said. "After tonight, there's no choice. They'll move from allied species to conditionally symbiotic apex. It will affect trade agreements, military cooperation, diplomatic protocols. It will take decades to negotiate the implications." "It should," Alara said. "It should have happened 30 cycles ago." A young Keth at Hashay, barely more than a cadet, his uniform still crisp with newness, approached the advisory bench with the hesitant gait of someone who knew he was intruding but could not stop himself. "Dr. Vance," he said, his translator rendering his voice in a tone of careful deference, "may I ask a question?" Ilara nodded. "What makes them angry enough? You said the door can be broken. You said if we push them past a threshold." He trailed off, unable to complete the thought. "What is the threshold? What should we avoid?" Ilara looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked past him, at the empty chamber, at the star map still glowing faintly on the central display, at the territory boundaries that seemed so permanent and so fragile. "That's the mercy of them," she said quietly. "They've made it very hard to reach the threshold. Their entire global society is engineered to prevent it. They have created systems of justice, mechanisms for redress, institutions designed to resolve conflict before it escalates. They have spent millennia learning to absorb insult, to forgive injury, to choose peace even when war would be easier. Their restraint is not weakness. It is the most sophisticated defense mechanism ever evolved. And it takes a great deal to overcome it. She paused. You have to take something from them that they cannot replace. You have to hurt someone they cannot protect. You have to make them feel helpless. And humans despise helplessness more than they despise anything else in the universe. If you do that, if you push them to the point where their systems of redress fail and their institutions cannot help them, and their restraint becomes a liability instead of a strength, then the door opens. The young attaché's secondary eyelids had stopped moving entirely. And once it opens, Alara continued, it does not close easily. You saw what happened in 12 seconds with a trained soldier who lost control for a moment. Now imagine an entire population. Imagine billions of humans, all realizing simultaneously that their restraint has been mistaken for weakness, that their mercy has been exploited, that the predators have returned, and this time there is nowhere to run. Imagine what happens when the awful arithmetic engages not in one human, or 100, or 1,000, but in an entire species. She stood, gathering her worn data tablet, and the shawl she had brought to every briefing for 30 cycles. I have spent my career trying to prevent that from happening, not because I fear what humanity would become. I know what they would become and I have made my peace with it, but because I know what it would cost them. They would win. They always win when the door opens, but they would lose something in the process, something precious, something their entire civilization exists to preserve, and I would spare them that loss if I could. She looked at the young attaché one final time. So to answer your question, what should you avoid? You should avoid mistaking their kindness for vulnerability. You should avoid interpreting their patience as passivity. You should avoid the assumption that their reluctance to fight means they cannot. And most of all, you should avoid giving them a reason to stop holding back. She walked toward the exit, her footsteps echoing in the empty chamber. At the threshold, she paused and looked back. You asked which humans are trained. I told you to pray none are angry. What I didn't tell you, what I've never told anyone, is that I stopped praying 30 cycles ago. Because I know my own species. And I know that someday, somewhere, someone in this galaxy is going to make the mistake of pushing them too far. And on that day, no prayer in the universe will be enough to save the ones who did the pushing. She stepped through the doorway and was gone. Commander Voran stood alone in the empty chamber, the star map still glowing, the territory boundaries still fixed in their false permanence. After a long moment, he reached out and deactivated the display. The last thing to fade was the small cluster of stars labeled human space, unremarkable in volume, unremarkable in resources, and now, by Academy decree, reclassified as the most dangerous territory in the known galaxy. He thought about Rosa Kincaid, standing in the ashes of her life, remembering what humans were supposed to forget. He thought about the man in the footage, whose father had called him back from somewhere terrible with nothing but a name. He thought about Alara Vance, who had spent 30 cycles trying to save the galaxy from her own people, and who had finally, tonight, told the truth. And then he thought about the young Torek diplomat's question, and Alara's answer, and the prayer she no longer said. The chamber was very, very quiet. Outside, in the corridors of the Grand Academy, the delegates spoke in hushed voices and did not look at each other. The reclassification order was already propagating through the Academy's systems. By morning, every species in the galaxy would know what had been said in the Hall of Concordant Voices. By morning, humanity's place in the interstellar order would be forever changed. But in her quarters, Dr. Alara Vance sat alone in the dark, and she did not feel triumph or vindication or relief. She felt only the weight of 30 cycles of silence, finally broken, and the knowledge that she had told them the truth and they still did not fully understand. They would, she knew. Someday they would. And on that day, she would not need to pray, because the universe would already be praying for itself.